let me move to our guest speaker. Wilbur Ross was sworn in by Vice President Mike Pence as the 39th Secretary of Commerce on February 28, 2017. And he was, of course, the principal business voice for the administration, for the first Trump administration. But he has also a background as a businessman. He is the founder, former chairman, chief strategy officer of W.L. Ross and Company, a major financial company in New York. And he has decades of experience in investment banking, private equity. In his career, he has restructured, get ready for this, especially our banker friends here, so that you can make comparison, $400 billion of restructure or loan restructuring and investment in assets like airline, in industry, sorry, it's like airline, apparel, auto parts, banking, beverage, chemical, credit card, electric utility, food service, furniture, real estate, and so on and so forth. He has been chairman or lead director of over 100 companies operating in more than 20 different countries. Bloomberg Markets named him as one of the most 50 influential people in global finance, and he is the only person elected of both of the Private Equity Hall of Fame and the Turnaround Management Hall of Fame. He served as a privatization advisor to Mayor Giuliani in New York. He was appointed by President Clinton on the board of the U.S. Russia Investment Fund. And he got a big award from South Korea for helping during the financial crisis. President Kim Dae-jung awarded Secretary Ross with a medal, and the Emperor of Japan awarded him with the Order of Rising Star. He's also a great philanthropist. He served as chairman of the Japan Society, trustee of the Brookings Institution, chairman of the Economic Studies Council, and he's international council member of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs de Paris and of the Blenheim Foundation and many more. He was on the advisory board and member of the advisory board of Yale University School of Management. I mentioned his book, and I should mention also, for some of you that are old enough or have been in New York enough, an Italian connection that the Secretary has with a man that has been a pillar of our community. He was rather abrupt and some people would say rude in his way of being, but he was the most charming, wonderful man. He led Assicurazioni Generali for quite a while here in New York. His name was Alessandro Cordero di Montezemolo, called the Marquise. And the connection is very, very easy. Hillary Ross, Wilbur's wife, is the niece of Kathy Murray, who was the wife of Alessandro. So technically, Wilbur has been the nephew or step-nephew of Alessandro di Montezemolo. Please give him a big applause, and I would like to ask you to come to the podium. Tell us, how was it being the nephew of Alessandro Montezemolo?
Well, I never knew him very well, but I understand he was just as friendly and as cordial to his in-laws as he was to other people.
Well, yeah. Anyone here remembers Alessandro? Okay, there they are. A few, of course. Well, he was a fantastic character and a big representative for our community. So let's start. I mean, you have quite a busy resume. But what's interesting, I think, about you, Wilbur, is that you started really everything on your own. You enrolled in the ROTC, and then you moved to university with fellowships. Why don't you tell us about your very beginning and what did you have in mind, so that we can address some of the things you discussed in your book?
Okay. Well, my very first contact with corporate America was when I was 17, I got a job as a car parker at the Monmouth Park Jockey Club in Oceanport, New Jersey. And that was the first real third-party paycheck. So the first morning, Louis the lot boss brought the 20 of us young kids who were going to be parkers together, and he said, let me tell you fellas how things work here. He said, we know that no matter how careful you are, there will be some accidents, cars will get damaged. But here's the thing, if the person who owns the car notices the damage before leaving the track, then the track has to pay and you'll lose a week's pay. But I have a solution. You must distract the person. Distract the person. He said, yes. For example, if it's a convertible, put the top up while you bring him the car. Then the man will say, you stupid kid, why are you putting the top up while you're driving? And he won't notice the right front headlight. And if it's not a convertible, turn the radio on real loud and turn the windshield wipers on. And then he'll also get angry, but he won't notice what happened.
Okay, so, I think these are very good hits for all of you when you're going to park.
It gets worse. So he said, now, as you know, we only pay minimum wage here, but you'll get some tips. But if you really want to make some money, you have to buy a concession from me, from Louis. Not from the track, but from Louis. So here we were getting into the second fraud that he was doing. The concessions would be things like this. Many people lock a child in the car while they're 6 hours at the racetrack in a blazing hot day, or they'll put a dog or a cat, or sometimes a child and a pet. So one of the concessions was we would park their car under the trees so it would be a little bit cooler. So we all signed up, and the deal was Louis got half and we got half. Track got nothing from it. One boy from Brooklyn said, well, Louis, I'm not going to buy one of your concessions. I've invented my own concession. And his concession was this. Let's say you were the first car he handled. He would tell you, I know who's going to win the first race, and it's the number 1 horse. And maybe you were the second person. He'd tell you the 2 horse, and tell him the 3 horse. So he would naturally have a certain number of winners to the first race. Whoever won the first race would come racing back out, because now they wanted to know who was going to win the second race. And this time he said, I gave you the first one free, but you have to give me $10 to know who's going to win the second race.
Okay, so this tells us that is. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish. Yeah.
So he made more money than the rest of us. But the story had a tragic ending. 30 years later, he went to jail for stock fraud. So he learned the lesson at the track too well.
Too well. Well, I was about to say, forget business school or university, because clearly that is the best school to start young and to be exposed to that. But as we hear, it's probably also better to go to university. So you then moved to university. How did you start? You started to work in the financial world, and then you went on your own.
Yeah, well, what really happened, when I went to Yale, I wanted to be a creative writer, a fiction writer. And Yale had a very good course called Daily Themes. Every day you had to put 1,000 words of fiction into a little slot, and then the teacher would review it with you and all that. Well, by the end of the second week, I was out of material. So I quit the course and went to Wall Street instead. So as a failed writer, they saved me a lifetime of poverty.
and the rest is history, as they say. So let's get to your meeting with Donald Trump, to get to know him. If I remember correctly from the book, you tell the story, it was not the most friendly initial encounter, because he was dealing with his casinos in New Jersey, and I think they were not doing well, and you came in to restructure them, and you had to negotiate with him.
Yes.
So is that right? So what was how was he back then?
Well, this was in 1990. He was building the Trump Taj Mahal casino, and he had gotten some American investment banks to sell $800 million of first mortgage bonds on the casino. The only problem was they never paid one interest payment. They defaulted before the first interest payment. So on the Thursday before Memorial Day weekend, the bondholders hired me to help them. We had done a lot of restructuring before. We did Texaco, we did Pan Am, we did TWA, we did National Gypsum, we did a bunch of steel companies. We did a lot. So we were very much in that business when I was at Rothschild. So he calls me and says, you must come down to Atlantic City the next morning. Well, the last place I wanted to be for Memorial Day weekend was Atlantic City, with tens of thousands of people playing slot machines. But I went down. His helicopter was waiting for me at the old 63rd Street heliport, and you could pick it out because in gigantic nail polish red letters, TRUMP on the side of it. So about 30 minutes later, we land in Atlantic City, right on the boardwalk, and Trump is there in a big stretch limo. And as I got in the car, I noticed something. There were two flags on the front bumper of the car. One was an American flag, and the other was a Trump flag. And the Trump flag was a little bigger than the American card. So that was a demonstration of his understatement of things. So we get inside the casino, mobbed with people, and by then he had become a kind of cult figure. So people were having him sign their beanie hat, they were having him sign their notepad. One lady was in a bareback dress. She had him sign her back. What she wanted Donald J. Trump and magic marker on her back for, I'll never know. So we go upstairs to start to negotiate. And now I began to learn how Trump's negotiating style works. He began by saying, as you know, the bonds are trading at 20 cents on the dollar, and your holders will be very lucky if they end up with 20 cents. So why don't we, instead of arguing a lot, I'll just personally guarantee that they'll get 20 cents and we can be friends. I said, well, Donald, the only problem is the bondholders hired me to get them 100 cents plus their interest, plus some shares in the casino. So we have a little value disconnect here. So we went at it for about 2.5 hours, and I could not get him to budge. Not one penny, nothing. So I finally said to him, well, Donald, is this as far as you're prepared to go today? And he said, yes, 20 cents, that's it, and they'll be very lucky to get it. So I said, well, I'm not going to waste my time here. And I walked out on him. And that shocked him because that was the kind of tactic he was used to using on other people. So it was a kind of corporate jujitsu that if somebody would walk out on him. But we've then continued to fight. And so that was the next thing I learned. He likes to negotiate in the media. You perhaps have noticed that. And so he would call me names, I would call him names. It went on for a few months, very aggressive arguing with each other in the media. Finally, we were getting closer and closer to our objective. So one morning in October,
Which was, give us what was your secret objective? What was your secret? You said, I want 100 plus the interest, but you would have been happy with what? With 70, with 80?
well, we got our 100 cents, we got our interest, and we got 49%.
Okay, no, then go back to the story. Well, yeah, no, go back. How did you get that?
Well, here's how we finally got there. I went to his office this October morning and said, Donald, we've been at this enough, we're close enough. Here's our best and final offer. And if we can't make a deal today, we're going to put you in bankruptcy tomorrow. Put the Taj Mahal in bankruptcy. He turned the offer down. So I went back to my office and I put out a press release. Trump Taj Mahal bondholders are having a very important press conference at the Marriott Marquis at 5 p.m. As soon as he saw it on the newswire, he called me. He said, Wilbur, what the hell is this? What are you doing at the Marriott Marquis? We picked that because it was not one of his hotels. So I said, well, Donald, I told you if we couldn't make a deal today, we were going to put you in bankruptcy. And that's what we're going to announce at the 5 o'clock meeting. So he said, let me get with my advisors. They got there. We negotiated a little more, and finally we had a deal. And then he said, but one more thing. And I had spent enough time with him that I knew usually when he said one more thing, it was a real zinger. And this time, the one more thing was, you have to move the press conference to the Plaza Hotel. So we made the deal. And as you can appreciate, I was pretty worn out. This was a pretty stressful day, even by my standards. So I'm in the limo being driven home, and the phone rings. This is your mother, said in just about that angry a voice. I said, hi, Mom, everything okay? No, everything is not at all okay. I said, what's the matter? She said, well, I'm playing mahjong with my lady friends while we were watching that disgraceful press conference you were putting on with Donald Trump. And we all feel that after those mean things he said, you should not have made a deal with him. I said, but Mom, that's my job. That's how I make a living. And she said, well, we don't agree. We think you've lost all your self-respect. And she said, if you'd only become a lawyer like I always wanted you to, then you wouldn't have to hang around with people like that. She eventually forgave me for making the deal with Trump, but she never did forgive me for not becoming a lawyer.
Very funny. So then you stayed friends at that point, because there is a gap between the 90s and then, many years later, about 25 years later, you were supporting him and you became Secretary of Commerce. So,
right. Well, in between, he actually hired me because he got involved with a lot of messy things. So I ended up doing quite a bit of work for him over the next 20 some odd years.
So he appreciated your negotiating skills and says, I better have them on my side.
We knew each other pretty well. And the story I told you about walking out, he tells the story himself. He thinks it's very amusing. So it's not that I'm telling you something out of school.
So, and how was being...
I have a question for...
Sorry, no questions later, John Maria. We open the question in about half an hour. Okay, thank you. And you will be the last at this point for having interrupted. Apologies. apologies, Secretary. You know, Italians can be very unruly sometimes. So, but going forward, so how was being Secretary of Commerce with him? Because it's quite authoritarian. You had some times where you had disagreements. We are not used to see today people, members of his cabinet, the cabinet, disagreeing with him. So what was Trump 1 and what were your disagreements with him?
Well, as you know, he's a person of very strong opinions. But if you make a forceful enough case, and if it's a strong enough case, he'll come around. So early on, one of the things was we were getting ready to renegotiate the NAFTA treaty with Canada and Mexico. And some of the White House staffers were encouraging Trump first to quit NAFTA and then negotiate. I felt it would be much better to stay in, but use the threat of quitting as a negotiating chip. So I spent quite a little time one morning talking with him about it, and I wasn't quite sure that he had come around. So I asked him if it would be all right if I got Sonny Perdue, who was the new Agriculture Secretary, to come over and join the discussion. He said yes. Sonny had this chart, all the states, and then how much agriculture each one did, and how much of the agriculture was exported to Canada and to Mexico. And then in very big letters, which of those states voted for Trump. Well, so I got Sonny to show him the chart, and that carried the day. He decided not to withdraw from NAFTA and yet let the negotiations take place.
Well, which is not the technique that he has used in this current administration.
Yeah, it's not so different.
He has been more on the attack. And, you know, moving forward, July 9th is a big day for all of us because we will finally know whether there will be some kind of an agreement. And let's talk about Europe first. The idea is that there may be some concessions on regulations and reciprocal stuff, and then maybe he will just keep the 10%. What is your impression? Is there going to be a success on July 9? Are we going to avoid a real trade war?
Well, I think there won't be a long-term trade war, mostly because the other countries cannot afford to have escalating tariffs, because trade with the U.S. is a larger percentage of their economy than our exports are to them. It's not just Europe, it's China, it's everybody is that way. And second, because their economies are also individual member states of Europe, individually much smaller, their exports are a larger percentage to us than ours to them. So what does that mean? That means a dollar's worth of trade problem imposed on us is not nearly as damaging as the dollar that he imposes on the other country. So that's a tough thing. But I think the hardest thing with Europe, when I was negotiating with the then trade negotiator, she had a hard time getting a mandate from the EU, because as you know, it's not really one entity, it's 27 countries, each of which has to sign on for anything of great consequence. So it's very difficult negotiating with someone who has to go back to 27 bosses. At least with Trump, there's only one person you need to talk to, so it was much smoother. But worse than that, I think that the EU back then didn't really intend to make concessions, because one of the other arguments I had with her was the restrictions Europe puts on foodstuffs coming from America, the chickens and all sorts of agricultural products. And she said, well, but Europeans won't eat stuff that has that chemical treatment. I said, well, if you're right, let us put them on the shelves, and if in fact Europeans won't eat them, they'll die on the shelves and we won't have a fight and we won't have to argue about that. Well, she didn't agree to that, and so we eventually was talked individually with the big German car manufacturers, and we got some concessions from them, and that was why we didn't put a huge tariff on cars right then. So we literally had to go around the EU trade negotiator to get anything done. So my worry is whether the EU will be in a real position to make concessions.
Okay, but on the other hand, the president, and then it will be interesting also to understand the dynamics of the decision-making process. But for example, he has imposed very high tariffs on certain industries, on steel, or there is the idea that he will impose them on pharmaceutical. That could be not good for American consumer, because in the end, the American consumer has to pay, and on cars, on semiconductors, and so on and so forth. So this process is, I mean, who is the most influential person today with the president? Or is it true that he tends to make a decision at the last minute with the last person that walks in with a good idea?
Well, it is true that he announces things at the last minute. It's not necessarily true that he hasn't made his mind up before. But I think the most hopeful thing for Europe, if Europe will make some concessions, would be what Trump did with the auto industry in the UK in the deal that was just negotiated with them. UK had been selling us about 91,000 cars per year, and Trump gave them a quota, a generous quota of 100,000. So if they sell 100,000 or fewer, there's no special tariff on the cars. But if they sell more than 100,000, there's a pretty high tariff. So I think the best that Europe can hope for on the sensitive products might be some sort of a combination of quotas and then tariffs over a quota.
Yeah.
We did that with Korea also when I was there. So I think that's a structure that would help the American consumer in that there's no inflation on the stuff that's imported within the quota. And the only inflation would come from the excess. So if Europe is making concessions, it wouldn't surprise me if he were willing to do that kind of a deal, because we saw it worked well with some products from Korea, and now he's doing it with the UK.
Is there something that you disagree with his trade policy approach that he has taken now, maybe too aggressive?
Well, in this sense, to me, a small tariff, a 10% tariff, is pretty much absorbable, because the exporter will absorb some, the exporting government might absorb some, the importer absorbs some, consumer some. You can sort of spread around a 10%. But once you get to 30 or 40%, it's too big. You can't spread that around. It will have a real effect. So when he went to 150%, there was no point to that. Anything over the 40, they were not going to be able to send any product in anyway. So I think that was kind of his style of really supercharging things. And I think he never intended it to go to anything like 140 or 150%. But it gets everybody's attention. And think about it. If he had started out saying, I want a 10% tariff on everything, the world would be screaming and yelling, oh, that's horrible, the sky has fallen, you can't have a 10% tariff. Now, I don't know of a single country that wouldn't be thrilled if they ended up with a 10% tariff. So you've seen his strategy in my book has already worked in that he has set a floor under what the tariffs might be that's higher than he probably could have gotten in a conventional negotiation. So while people complain, and the other thing, because he likes to do everything in the press, that means he likes to make everything very dramatic. And that's why you talk about 100% tariff, 150, that dominates the news cycle, both in our country and in the other countries. And so he kind of uses the media as a weapon to frighten people.
Yeah. So there was one point that we were all a bit confused, which was claiming that the value-added tax, which is all across Europe, was protectionist.
Well,
Which
it is.
okay, so what? So we can have a debate here now, because
Okay.
I claim, and many people here claim, that it's not, because it's a tax that everybody has to pay and everybody will recover.
No, but here's the difference. We don't have a VAT in the States. And what does that mean? That
But
means,
that's your problem.
Hmm?
That's the problem of the U.S., not our problem.
No, but that's fine to say it's a problem for the U.S.
Yeah.
But we tried twice, this is not under Trump, this is earlier president, we tried twice to get the WTO to approve a system that would have the same net effect as the WTO, as the VAT rebates had. And both times the WTO voted it down, and the European panel member especially voted it down. So here's why it's bad. If I'm Mercedes or Fiat or anybody and selling a car in my home country, my customer pays the 25%, but I get it back when I export it. So you could literally sell the vehicle for a lower price to an American consumer than you can to your domestic consumer. Whereas the American manufacturer, because we don't have that system, they will pay the 25% selling. So American company has to pay charge a higher price in Europe than it charges in the U.S. Whereas the European company charges a lower price in the U.S. than in Europe. There's no rationality to that.
Yes, but once they sell it, the VAT is paid by the consumer, not by the American producer.
Well, but it affects the market share. I mean, surely you're not saying that if you have to pay 25% more for a vehicle, it has no impact on the market.
But you're specifically mentioning just the export, but for the domestic market, there is no competition.
No, I understand.
In other words, if Fiat has to pay the 25%,
that's true.
and then the American car will pay 25%, goes on the consumer. It's only in the case, as you were saying, that the European manufacturer exports the car, recovers the 25%, and can sell for less, depending
Sure.
whether the price is less.
And what do you think is the reason why Europe rebates the VAT? They rebate it to encourage export. That's the purpose of it.
Well, yeah, also
Well,
because
I mean,
people
it
are
is.
unhappy in Europe. You know, Italy has 25% or 20%, France has less. So there is a big debate. But here you have the consumer tax, which is the equivalent.
Oh, but they're much smaller.
Well, 8%, 10%, yes. So
Well, not
depending
usually
on
6 or 8, but that's not as much. And the other real problem is it isn't just that. There's also a 10% tariff which American companies pay on top of the VAT on cars.
Oh.
So it's not quite as simple as you describe it.
It seems simple, as you can imagine. Behind the scene, the negotiation that goes into these details. So you had a little bit of a taste of how difficult it is, no, to proceed
All
and to
that
negotiate.
Europe would have had to do would be use their influence to convince the WTO to let us put in an equivalent system. And if they had, we wouldn't be having this debate.
Let's move to China, and then we'll open it up to the floor, whoever wants to ask some question. So the president has been very aggressive with China using his tactic, but he found an equal response that then sort of brought him back to the negotiating table. And particularly when China said, okay, we stop any export of rare metal, and so the president backed off. So what do you think? That China is a giant that it's hard to deal with? They knew how to deal with him? Are we going to have a big fight with China, or is there possible to find a solution there too?
Well, what this country is doing, and what I tried but failed to accomplish in Trump's first administration, I tried to get them to subsidize the rare earth industry, because China subsidizes the processing of rare earths. Rare earths are not really rare. And in fact, in the U.S., they're very plentiful. We have huge reserves. The problem is China has driven the processing cost so low that it's uneconomical to do it. And so what our government is doing as we sit here, they are subsidizing companies to start to do it. Problem is it's going to take a year or two to get the mines into production and the processing. So Trump has a timing problem with rare earth, not a permanent problem. It isn't like China's problem with oil. China doesn't have decent oil reserves, and they never will. So it's not like that. This is an artificial problem that we can solve with money and with time. So in a sense, the reason Trump has been stringing things out with China is, meanwhile, we're moving to replace our dependence on them.
Okay. You mentioned oil. Very, very, very quick question, and then again I open to the floor. But there is worry about what's happening after the bombing in Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, and what is your feeling today? That we are on a solution, or on a way out, or was it the right thing to do to bomb the nuclear plants? And
well, yeah, I think we have to go back to Trump 1 and to the first meeting that President Xi had with President Trump. It was at Mar-a-Lago early in 2017. So we were new in the government, and Trump was new. And it was scheduled to start with a big ceremonial dinner at Mar-a-Lago at 6:30. But at 2 that afternoon, I got a call from one of Trump's aides saying there was an emergency National Security Council meeting at Mar-a-Lago at 4 o'clock. Trump had put me on the Security Council in addition to Commerce. So I went over, and if you look in the book, in the photographs, you'll see we're all crowded into this little tiny room at Mar-a-Lago, a safe room, and that was where we made the decision to launch the 52 missiles into Syria to punish them for attacking one of our bases. And Trump made what I think was the most important foreign policy decision of his first term. And that was he decided not to delay the announcement for 2 days till the conference with the Chinese ended, but instead to announce it in the middle of the dinner at 7:15 that evening. So we did. And the reason I think that was important is several things. One, I'll tell you Xi's reaction, but more than that, I think a major part of the reason why global things were relatively calm during Trump's administration was that he did that very massive retaliation. It made people think, our potential enemies think, this guy's dangerous. If I push him too far, he's liable to do something I really don't like. And in any negotiation, in any power struggle, if you are viewed as a wild card, you have an advantage. And if you're viewed as someone who is in a position to take very decisive action and has shown that he's willing to, it gives him a better negotiating position. So anyhow, so we're at the dinner, and Xi is dominating the dinner, speaking in Chinese through an interpreter, giving us his version of the history of China. And he had just finished explaining how bad the colonial powers were to China, and he was about to get to World War II when an aide came up, gave Trump a little note. Well, I knew what was in the note. It was saying we launched the missile. So Trump said, Mr. President, I don't mean to interrupt, but something very important has just happened, and I want you to hear it from me, not to pick it up from your intelligence. So he told him about the missiles. Xi, who had been speaking only in Chinese, said in perfect English, please repeat, please repeat. So that was a lesson we learned, that all the stuff that him having to go through the interpreter was for his convenience, not and to slow things down. But what was also interesting, what was Xi's reaction? He just said, well, Mr. President, you had a busy afternoon. And he went right back to his history lecture, picking up exactly where he left off. So we then learned, this guy doesn't blink, he doesn't go off message, he doesn't get flustered. It taught us a lot about the interpersonal relationship that we're about to have with him. So he's a very tough cookie.
Very tough cookie, we both of them. So, questions? Yes?
He's thinking of the short term, okay, let's shock them with some media boutade or 150% of tariffs, and then everybody's happy with 10, but that's a short-term result. I think that the relationship with the other side is damaged by having this kind of
well, I know the theory.
Isn't this something that he's thinking about?
I understand the theory. The theory that Americans have had for many years is that somehow it makes a foreign country a better ally if you have a trade deficit with them. That's really, well, that's in fact what they've been thinking. They've been saying, but if we impose tariffs and we don't have such a big deficit, it'll hurt the relationship. Well, let's look at the reality. We have a trade surplus with Australia. They're probably our best ally. We have a trade surplus with UK. They're a very good ally. China, we have a big trade deficit. Do you think that's made them a good ally of ours? No. So the idea that trade deficits buy you some goodwill that's useful with other countries is a wrong idea. There's no evidence that that's true.
When you were saying that in the end you made an agreement and Donald Trump paid the bondholders, where did he come up with the money from?
Well, first of all, the casino was operating at cash flow, so he got it from there. But he didn't actually give us money. He gave us except for the back interest, that was cash. But he reinstated the bonds at the full face amount, and we got 49% of the equity in the casino.
Okay, so
you don't
it
have
was
to
an
come up
exchange.
with that,
Yeah. Stefania.
Hi, nice to meet you in person. I'm Stefania Spatti, the US correspondent of Class CNBC, Italian sister of CNBC. Question is, do you agree with Trump's attacks against Mr. Powell? And do you think that nowadays interest rates should be lower, as the president requests?
Okay. Well, let me describe my dealings with Powell because they intersect a lot with Trump. Powell was appointed to be the chair of the Federal Reserve in February of 2017. And by the end of March 2017, he had raised interest rates twice, even though, as you remember, we really didn't have inflation then. We had high employment, low unemployment. We didn't have inflation. But Powell raised them twice and indicated he was going to raise them more. So one morning at 6:30, which was the time when Trump usually called me, he would call, he had seen something on Maria Bartiromo's show about Powell. So he said, you got to call this guy and try to talk some sense to him. So I got Powell on the phone a little later, not 6:30 in the morning, and here was the discussion. I said, well, Mr. Chairman, we don't understand why you're raising rates right now. You can see from your own data, there's really no inflation. It's not a problem. Powell said, well, the Federal Reserve models show that if unemployment is below 4% for any lengthy period, there will be inflation, and we don't want inflation. So I said, well, Mr. Powell, why don't you wait until there's some sign that there is inflation? You have meetings almost every month, so the most you could be would be 1 month behind. Not a big deal. Why not wait till then? Powell said, that's what the models show. That's why we're going to keep doing it. And I have no obligation to talk to you. And I know everything I say to you will go back to Trump. And he hung up on me. So that was the nature of the relationship that we had. Then segue, we're now in the Biden campaign, this last campaign against Biden. He didn't have any trouble at all cutting rates, even though inflation was in fact still well over the 2% target. Suddenly Trump comes in, and now Powell has the theory, well, maybe one-time tariffs will cause permanent inflation. I think mathematically it's hard for that to be true, but in any event, he's hiding behind that. I think the fact is they get along terribly as people, and Powell is not going to do anything to help Trump. So whatever is the right answer, you'll get fewer rate cuts and more slowly with Powell and Trump than you otherwise would have. Now his term is up next year anyway, and that's the other complication. Trump has made it very clear he will never reappoint Powell. So there's no leverage that he has over Powell. So Powell's going to do what he feels like.
Stefano, last question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. This is very, very interesting. I'm a journalist, and I want to ask you, alternative truth. Is for Trump something that he uses with the media? He likes to talk about alternative truth, or also with his cabinet. When he was talking to you, he had that way to believe on certain things, or maybe pretending to believe on certain things. What is your take on that? Does alternative truth exist for him, or is it just a strategy?
Well, I think Many of the people in the cabinet I think are very, very well qualified. Scott Bessent, I think, is an excellent choice. Rubio, I think, is an excellent choice. There are several of them, those fellows I know quite well. Many of his cabinet I don't know that well, so I don't feel that qualified to make an opinion on them. But there is one big difference between the last cabinet and this one, and that is the last cabinet had relationships with Trump, like mine, that weren't necessarily political. They were real relationships. The present cabinet, mostly all MAGA people, so there's kind of part of that whole ecosystem that has a whole set of beliefs. So the potential for there to be disagreement between this cabinet and the president is much smaller than it was last time. Last time I was a cautionary influence, Mnuchin was, a number of us were, because it all came about differently. Also, the last time Trump was not as powerful as he is this time. Remember, he was under all this litigation and impeachment things and this and that, and he didn't control the Republican Party, and he didn't really control either house in the Congress. So he was in fundamentally a weaker position. Now, he does control the Republican Party, and he's shown he has fairly good control, even though it's a small majority. He has fairly good control of both houses. Plus, the fact that all these people in the cabinet are acolytes of him. They all buy the MAGA story.
They owe him completely.
It's
yes.
all of those are different factors from what were at play the first time.
Thank you. The last question, Consul General.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Fabrizio Di Micheli, thank you.
Yeah,
Our Consul General of Italy here in New York and in Tri-State.
I'd like to go back to the tariffs, because you mentioned before, we focused on the negotiating tactics and said they are successful. But what about the long-term strategy? The declared strategy of Trump is to bring back manufacturing in the United States. And probably, to follow what you said before, one day to run a surplus with China. So do you think this is realistic?
Okay. Well, his longer-term strategy has three legs to it. One is reshoring businesses back to the U.S. and encouraging foreign direct investment in the U.S. So that's one whole big block. Second big block is tax policy. And hopefully very soon he's going to get that through.
There is also the revenge tax. What do you think of the revenge tax in that? I mean, as part of the bill that is being debated, there is this revenge tax, meaning to tax foreign companies coming here, and that will discourage investments. I'm sorry, part of the tax debate. I don't know if you've seen that.
I'm not going to get into all the details of the tax bill. It's several thousand pages, but it is central to his thinking. He sees tariffs, one, as a revenue source to help pay for his tax cuts. Two, he sees it as a way to help American businesses. And three, he sees it as a way to get other diplomatic victories, like fentanyl from China, like helping out with fentanyl from Mexico, things like that, like getting Europe to pay more for NATO, those kinds of things. He's using tariffs with all those different objectives. Then the final part of his three legs is deregulation. He has already canceled something like 3,300 executive orders that Biden put in, and he's got more to go. He's going to deregulate. And I'll tell you, toward the end of the Trump administration, when American businesses would come in to see me, almost every single time they said, we're grateful for the tax cuts, we're grateful for the tariffs in the industries that we tariff, but what really helped us the most is deregulation. And so that's a central part of what he's doing. And deregulation ends up costing companies money, and it costs the public money.
Okay. On that note, I think we'll give a big round of applause to our guest speaker. Thank you. Thank you for being with us, Wilbur. And he very kindly brought his book. He's signed. Each copy is signed. So if you haven't taken it, they should be sitting out there.
Now, if you read the book and you like it, please do me one favor. Send a favorable review to Amazon.
Thank you all for being here.